Hello, and welcome to our webinar. Today we will discuss what HR needs to know about handling employee data. And my name is Marinke. I work as a customer success specialist here at Hailey HR, and I will be discussing this topic today with Jacob.
Yes, my name is Jacob. I work here at Hailey as a legal counsel and a data protection officer.
Yes. So we will start by discussing the actual fundamentals of the GDPR and then move on to cover the actual risks associated with not being compliant. And of course, we will also end by providing some insight into how these risks can be eliminated. But before we jump into the subject, some practicalities about the platform for the webinar. So you can ask your questions in the Q&A that you have on the right side. And you can also, if you want to book a demo of Hailey, you can do that by the link we have on the bottom of the page here. So we will take all of the questions at the end of the webinar. And please know that we will not be able to give you any specific legal advice, but anything regarding that topic that we are discussing, we'll be happy to answer. So before we jump into the actual fundamentals of the GDPR, you may be wondering who is Hailey and what are we doing here? So a brief introduction of who we are. So Hailey HR is a comprehensive HR platform where we want to manage the entire employee lifecycle in one system while doing it in GDPR safe and or a safe and GDPR compliant way. And since we were founded in 2020, so after the GDPR actually came into play, that means we've had these principles in mind ever since the beginning. So our mission is to provide HR simplicity in all processes, which of course includes simplicity with being compliant with the GDPR. That's not always so simple. So jumping into the actual subject, Jacob, can you give a brief introduction of the GDPR?
Yes, the GDPR is an abbreviation of the General Data Protection Regulation. So it's a European law that is now celebrating its 6th birthday, the 25th of May. So it was established in 2018, and the need for legislation was greater than ever due to the fast-paced innovation in technology and the digitalization of our society. So a lot of personal data is now being utilized by companies.
Okay, how you said it was utilized by companies, but what is it actually used for by these companies?
So information on who you are as a person is now being used as a sort of currency online. This can be used to pay for websites and services, such as Facebook, for an example. And the way you pay is by viewing ads, and the website itself generates a profile on you that they can sell to ad makers.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, they generate a profile so that you also get the ads you may be interested in. Is that necessarily always a bad thing, or can it also be something positive?
It can, of course, be both good and bad. The core issue here is that the right to privacy is a fundamental right for all European Union citizens. It is something that is stated in the Charter of the European Union. And this right is the foundation of the GDPR, that the individual should own their own data. Companies may hold the data, process it, and enrich it and gain insights, but it belongs to the individual. And therefore, this law, the GDPR, is here to protect the individual.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about personal data. It can be used to both positive and negative matters by companies. But what actually counts as personal data? How comprehensive does it need to be? For example, my first name, could that be something that counts as personal data as well?
Yes, your name is a clear identification on who you are as a person, so that counts as personal data. It is oftentimes not a sensitive type of data, that is just your name. Small pieces of information might look harmless on its own, but small pieces build a bigger puzzle. My name is Jacob. That is not sensitive in its own nature, and I have glasses. If you look at glasses on its own, it's not sensitive. But once you put glasses on Jacob, now you learn these two pieces of information together is that Jacob has bad eyesight. Now it becomes a bit more sensitive because now we have information regarding my health, my bad eyesight. And health and biometric data is sensitive in its own nature. These small pieces of information is being collected all over the internet and by companies. A lot of it by cookies when you visit different websites. They learn small pieces of information and build a profile on you. This information can then be used to influence you. For an example, to buy new shoes. That is pretty much a good thing because I need new shoes. But it can also be used for more nefarious reasons, such as influencing my political opinions, to nudge me in certain directions before a general election, for an example. And this is something that we have seen in the last years, that this leads to a larger polarization in a lot of countries. Something I'm sure that you all have noticed in something that has grown the last few years. But of course, a lot of personal data is also being given by the individual directly to companies, partly through like membership clubs, but also to your employer. And then we come into a little bit more about employee and HR and how you can handle your employee data. The information that companies hold on their employees can be very sensitive in their nature. It can be information regarding my salary, my bank details, but also my health, any rehabilitation or any performance reviews, if I have any warnings regarding my employment.
All right. So what is then the core reason that this type of data, the employee data that you mentioned, the data that HR holds, what's the main reason that that is considered the most sensitive type of data?
It is sensitive because it's very personal information about me. It is very private information. For example, my salary, if I have any health concerns, if I have any rehabilitation cases. That is information that is not something that you would find online or you would find anywhere else. It's something that would only exist within your company. And data protection in its core is the protection of privacy and integrity of the individual. Companies are, of course, still able to process a lot of this data, and they might need to be able to process this data. The important thing here is to have a clear purpose on why you collect this data and why you process this data. You cannot change this purpose in the future, so you need to have it clear before you gather the information. When the purpose then is fulfilled, you can no longer hold this data, so you need to dispose of it and delete it in a correct manner.
Okay, thank you for a great introduction into the fundamentals of the GDPR and what it actually means and entails for HR. But since the GDPR is something that's only valid in the European Union, is there something outside of the EU that's like similar regulations in other regions?
Yes, thank you. Of course, there's a lot of different jurisdictions have laws regarding privacy. How you look upon the question in its core is a bit different, and we often look to the US for a contrast, because we as European Union citizens, we use a lot of American technologies. A lot of the IT infrastructure and internet infrastructure is American, and we use these American services. And in the US, they focus a lot more about national security than the integrity of the individual, where the individual's right to privacy is not premiered. And in the EU, we tend to look at it from a more proportionality standpoint. Of course, we also want to fight crime here in the EU, and we want to have national security. But there need to be probable cause and some leads that points to a person of interest for us to be able to process that data for those purposes. In the US, this process looks a bit more like gathering haystacks in bulk in search of a possible needle, whereas in the EU, we need to know that there is a needle in this specific haystack for us to be able to process and search for that data. This is something that Edward Snowden blew the whistle about a few years ago, how broad American surveillance is in the internet age.
Okay, that's a great example and really kind of puts it into a nutshell what the differences are. And there's no denying that's quite a contrast in how we view personal data and the security of it. This does have to affect the relations between the EU and the US in some way, or does it?
Yes, yes, it does. This was one of the core reasons behind the Schrems judgments. I'm guessing a lot of you have heard about the Schrems 2 judgment. That was the latest case. And that made it pretty much illegal to send data via American processors. So you could not send data from the EU to the US. And this comes from the name Schrems comes from an Austrian guy called Maximilian Schrems, who is a privacy activist. He was an Austrian law student, and while studying in America, he heard a lawyer from Facebook pretty much brag about how much you can do with EU data, because EU didn't really have any legislation for this. When he returned to Europe, he decided to sue Facebook, and eventually the Court of Justice of the EU took the case, and the result was that the agreement that made it possible to transfer data between the EU and the US was struck down. There became a new agreement, and Max sued them again, and he won again. So now twice he has won against Facebook, and the result is that you couldn't send data to the US anymore. This, of course, has huge implications. And since most IT infrastructure is American, the largest cloud providers are American, just by using these American companies, you could be in contradiction to the GDPR. Last summer, there was a third attempt, and we now have the third agreement called the Data Privacy Framework, which makes it once again possible to transfer data to America. But this third agreement still has a lot of the issues that were faced from the previous agreements, and the criticism is still there from the same standpoints, that we look at the right to privacy from a totally different standpoint. So the US and EU law is not compatible. So it is likely that when these complaints reach the courts again, that this agreement as well will be struck down, and we will find ourselves in the same place where you can't really use American services to process personal data.
Okay, but what does that really entail? Let's say I'm using or have American cloud providers currently, such as AVS. What does that mean for me and my company?
The issue there is the American surveillance laws make it possible that the authorities in America can claim the data that any American entity holds. So they can give away your sensitive data to American entities without any legal basis. And if you use American providers, then you can never be truly sure that the data isn't shared with any other parties. American laws allow these authorities to do this, so American companies have to abide by those laws. Those laws are incompatible with European laws and the GDPR. So we're in a quite of a difficult situation there. And the Court of European Justice works a bit differently. It works retroactive. So if the court would find in 1 or 2 years that this new agreement was not valid, you could be facing charges that you have been in breach of this the whole time. So you need to do your due diligence today and to make sure that the data that you hold or process is protected in every step of the way. And you can look at your own countries here as well and your own companies. Where do we store our data? And that is the important key takeaway here. Where do we store our data? And
Yes.
another important aspect is who. Who can access the information? You need to keep in line with the GDPR as well as other legislation on who has a right to access your data. Especially if this sensitive information, you need to be extra careful of this.
Okay, so if we take that back to the HR data and working with employee data, let's say, just for an example, I'm working as an HR manager. How can I make the distinction of which data I should be able to access and what not? Should I be able to access everything since my role is within GDPR? Or is there some kind of files, for example, or personal data that I should not be able to access? How do I make that judgment in my company?
Yeah, it is a difficult question. An HR manager in this example should, of course, be able to access a lot of HR files, for example. But maybe not regarding their colleagues. Maybe you can look at what area is this HR manager operating in. So you can look on people that are in that area, but maybe not the other business areas, and maybe not their own HR colleagues, and maybe not people working above them. This is something that is an issue both internally at your company, but especially if you do not use a dedicated system to handle HR data, it's hard to keep track on who has access. But it might also become an issue externally, to backtrack what I said previously, that who is your provider and who at your providers can access this data, and can they give it away to any third parties? And where are they located? So you need to look at what different laws might apply to them that you are not aware of. That could make them compelled to share your data with others. I like to think of a wordplay here where it's you need to keep it to the people who has a need to know and not the nice to know. You shouldn't give broader access to anyone than what's absolutely necessary for that purpose.
Okay, I like that wordplay. I think it kind of makes it clear as well. But could this be also applicable not only to who actually should access the data, but also what data we actually are allowed to store? So, I mean, basically, that a company only should keep the need to know data on their employees and not the nice to have data.
Yeah, this goes along with the core principle of the GDPR, data minimization. You shouldn't share more data than needed. You shouldn't keep more data than needed, and not view or access any more data than you need to view or access. And you also need to know what the data you keep. What is the data that I have stored here, and when can I process this data? This is especially important when it's sensitive in its nature. So you need to know when can we access this. For example, you could gather union membership for your employees that you need to have if you need to have a discussion with the trade unions. But this is not a data that you should access and process in any other cases. And you need to have a legal basis for any type of data you gather. And legal basis for companies is often consent, contract, a legal obligation, and legitimate interest. There are a few other legal bases that can be used, but these are the core ones that are being used by companies.
Okay, so that's quite a overview of how or what data you are allowed to store and why. But if we turn that around from the employer to the employee themselves, could I as an employee object to you as my employer storing personal data about me?
Yes, one of the rights given to all individuals in the GDPR is the right to object. So an employee could object to their employer that I do not want you to gather this data and use this data. But often the employer has a need to use that data, or at least it should have a need to use that data and a purpose. And then you need to either comply that, okay, we do not need this data, so we do not have to gather it. And otherwise, you need to show the employee that objects that the reason why you still need to use this data, and you need to do a test with legitimate interest to show that the reasoning and the purpose of it is not infringing on your integrity and your right to privacy. And finally, we come to the why. What is the reason for saving this piece of information? Is there a clear and dedicated purpose for the collection and storing of personal data? And this purpose cannot change over time. It needs to be stated from the beginning, and it cannot be changed.
Okay, but what kind of my question is, how do you know you have a good enough why or reason? Let's say, just to color an example again, my employer is storing my personal contact information, for example, my phone number and my email. After I leave the company, they just for the sole purpose that they might possibly maybe want to contact or rehire me in the future, they want to keep this data on me, so my personal phone number, email address. Is that okay? Is that a good enough why to maybe need the information in the future?
It's a great question. In that case, I would say no. The information you named was collected to be able to contact you regarding your employment and your job, not for any purposes outside of employment. So this data should therefore not be saved and stored after the termination of employment. So
Okay.
you could not save that for any possible reason to maybe re-employ you in the future. And therefore, it is paramount that companies do their best with internal processes, and also that they do their due diligence when selecting vendors to process personal data on their behalf, especially if it's something as sensitive as HR data.
Okay, so if if I'm using like third-party vendors or suppliers to help store data in different systems that I'm using as a company, for example, that includes personal data, would I, or I as a company, would I be liable if any of our vendors or suppliers are not compliant, even if my company is compliant in our operations?
Yes, actually, you are. You are responsible to ensure the security and integrity of the people that you hold data upon. And this responsibility reaches outside if you have any sub-processors or any vendors that deal this for you. So you need to ensure that they follow the same laws that you are governed by, and you can be held responsible if you do not do this due diligence.
Okay, and would that be, we were talking earlier about the EU justice system and the retroactive fine, so that could that be something that results in, I have vendors that are not compliant, could that result in my company being fined?
Yes, because you have not done your proper safety measures to protect the integrity of the people you hold data upon. And this is the purpose of the GDPR, the individual control. You do not own this data. The data belongs to the individual. You, as a company, process it and control the data. You can enrich it, make insights, but the data is finally owned by the individual. And companies are still, of course, able to process a lot of this data. Especially in employment, you need a lot of data to be able to. I need to know the salary of a person to pay out that salary. I need to know health care information to be able to help this person with rehabilitation. So you need to have the reasons why, and you need to make sure that only the correct people have access to this data. The important thing here is to have a clear purpose. And as I said previously, you can't change this purpose. So you need to have a stated purpose from the beginning. Because if you do this wrongly, the one affected is the individual. And the workplace should not be the place where data leaks from or where data is mishandled. And this is something we have thought about when building Hailey, that we have privacy by default.
Yes, exactly. And as you all can probably tell, there are a lot of risks to consider while storing and processing personal data on our employees. And as Jacob just mentioned, we definitely do not want to jeopardize this data for the employees and be the source where it leaks from, as the employee or the individual will always be the person affected if the data would be leaked or misused in some way. So, how can we work to eliminate these risks? First and foremost, we need to have control over the data we store. This can be very hard if it's spread over multiple computers. You might have physical documents in folders in a bookshelf somewhere on other files. So, the first step, or the one way to increase the control you have over data, is to have some kind of system support for it to make it possible for us to actually overview what data are we storing and how are we storing it, because that can be very difficult if it's spread over folders and computers and memory cards and so on. So here an HR system such as Hailey can help you gain control of your employee data and ensure you are storing it in a safe and compliant way. So this is one of the options to kind of gain the control of your data and start your journey towards compliance. And as I mentioned earlier, Hailey was founded prior to the GDPR. So this is something that has given us the opportunity to have all of the things that Jacob talked about with the 5 Ws, so the where, what, and who should access the data, and other fundamentals of the GDPR in mind when developing the platform and developing the system. So what we actually want to do is to provide privacy and security by default, which is why we focus on making compliance as easy and as accessible as possible for the users of Hailey. So here, Jacob already mentioned, but the importance of where we store our data is huge. So of course, I also want to mention that first and foremost, all of the data in Hailey is being stored on European servers in Amsterdam and Helsinki. But as GDPR is not only about where you store your data, even if that's a huge part of it, but also about why you are storing it, who has access to it. There are several other features in the system that we use to guide our users towards compliance. So an example of this is automatic shredding of data according to different data retention policies. This ensures that data is removed when an employee leaves the company, so as one part of the offboarding process. And in the system, what we've actually done is we have mapped out all of the data fields in Hailey to that contain personal data. We have mapped out to one specific retention policy, which ensures that every piece of personal data will be removed automatically in due time and not be laying around in a folder somewhere.
I think that's very interesting. Could you explain retention policies a bit further?
Yes, of course. So, um, depending on what kind of personal data we are storing and we're having in the system, we will want or need to retain it for different periods of time. So one piece of data can be of a very sensitive nature, and something that's completely insignificant to your employer after you leave the company. An example I like to use for this is allergies. So allergies is something that can be important to know while you are employed. So you might need it for catering purposes or events. So it's of high significance to know the allergies of your employees. Other information, such as your bank details, might be something that you need to keep a bit longer to be able to pay out the last check or paycheck. So for allergies, for example, the purpose of me having that information is to be able to organize events or cater to this employee's dietary needs. So of course, once I leave the company, that's totally insignificant to my employer. I will no longer be attending lunches or events, so they do not need to know my allergies, and that's why it should be removed directly when I leave. But if we go back to the bank details, if those would be removed at the same time as my allergies, we would be in big trouble as an employer, having difficulty to um, pay out the last salary of the employee. So this is just one example of how we have different types of data that will be needed to store in a different manner. So what the retention policies in their simplicity are they are different periods of time that we retain the data. So the allergies might be removed one day after you leave the company automatically. The bank details might be removed a few months or a year later. So we have many of these different policies so that we can ensure that we remove data not too early or not too late, but just at the right time, and are therefore compliant also with the GDPR. So when the purpose of the data is fulfilled, that's when we want it to be automatically removed. And making sure personal data is deleted at the right time is, however, not the only part of GDPR kind of features that we have in Hailey, even though it's a big part of that, and also kind of effectivizing the work of managers and HR not having to manually delete all of these personal data files when someone leaves. But we also want to help in how or who can access the data that we actually store in the HR system. So, due to very flexible roles and rights in the system, you can now easily ensure that only the right people actually have access to the personal data you are storing. So, this is also supported by the possibility to scope content in the system to choose who should be able to view what in different roles. So there you can completely define what HR should be able to see, what different roles within HR should be able to see, and managers and so on. So here we really want to make it easy to make sure that the data reaches the right person, but nothing more and nothing less either. And as we mentioned earlier with the example that we had on an employee that the employer was storing their personal contact information after they left. This is something that you're not allowed to do without consent of the employee. So another thing system support can help you with is consent management. So actually, if you want to send out some kind of consent form or contract to be able to prolong your purpose of the data or have a new purpose of data you already have collected, that's also something that a system can help you with. So there's a lot of different features as you can hear and tell, but really the core principle of what we want to do here is to make compliance as easy as possible for HR, for managers, and for companies using the platform. So I think the key points are to gain control of your data, and also be able to gather it in a safe way, and then also ensure that everything is deleted and removed in due time, but not too early. So that's a lot of details to keep track on if you're not having system support. So that's where we want to just make it as easy as possible.
Yeah. This is a lot of information, and we understand that. We have this Q&A function as well. I see we have already gotten a few questions, but you can ask your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to answer them as best as we can.
Yes. So if we take the first question here, someone is asking, did I understand you correctly that I am responsible for who my providers use to store our employee data?
Yes. You are responsible if you use any sub-processors, anyone who does the work for you. And this is very common because every company cannot do everything. You need to make sure that they follow the same laws and they have an equivalent protection that you would give your own employees. So you are responsible to make sure that the providers you use have the same security as you would give your employees. And if that's not the case, you are responsible for any breaches of the GDPR.
Yes, and we have a few other questions here. So first and foremost, why would you want to shred employee information over time instead of just deleting everything straight away?
I think this is something that Marinka talked about at the ending here. But you could have different reasons behind why you would save data for longer periods. It can be, for an example, if you have to terminate an employee, you might need to keep some data upon the termination for like the warnings and the performance reviews so that you could be protected against any wrongful termination clauses. Then you can save that data until the statute of limitation has passed. But some data, such as allergies, you do not need that data for any reason after termination. So that data should be shredded or deleted immediately.
Yes, and another point that I think is important to mention here is that shredding employee information over time also allows you to keep the information that's maybe not personal information, but that you can use for statistics and analytics. So something that's not personal data per se, but something that is in the employee file. So instead of deleting the entire profile and deleting the employee as if they were never there, we can just shred the personal info and then have all of the other information so that we can have the company analytics of how many employees were we at a certain date and what kind of employment types did we have, what were the salary levels, and so on. So kind of anonymize the data that we have on employees to be able to keep that as statistics as well.
Yeah, that's a great input. We also got this question here that is it GDPR compliant if you use an American system with servers storing the data within EU? This is quite a difficult question because the providers say it's compliant. The courts say no. And the reason behind this is that the American laws are extraterritorial. So that means that the American laws covers anything that is considered an American entity. So for an example, an American system with servers in the EU, as we said previously, AWS as a cloud provider, they have a subsidiary company in Europe, maybe called AWS Amsterdam. So they claim we are a European entity, but they are still owned by AWS, which is an American entity. Therefore, the authorities in America can compel the American company to take data from their subsidiary in Europe. So the subsidiary is owned by an American entity and therefore considered an American entity as well. So that would not be fully compliant. There would be extra steps of security, so it would be better, but it's not great. Because you would never know if this data is being sent or not, because these authorities in America, the NSA, FBI, CIA type, they have a gag order on these requests. So the companies cannot ever tell anyone that they have shared this data. And that goes against the GDPR because the GDPR gives us the right to information. We need to have information on who is storing our data. So it's quite tricky.
Yeah, quite tricky, but very interesting.
Yeah, we also had this question regarding the EU GDPR and US legislation, but how does that work in the UK post-Brexit? and what is the difference between the EU GDPR and the UK GDPR? And this question is great. The European Union can give out equivalented decisions that make it so that, yes, you can send data to this country. For an example, we have this with other countries that are not members of the European Union but have privacy laws that give our citizens the equivalent protection. The UK left the EU, but they got this decision that, okay, the UK is equivalent. And that is stretching for a few years at a time. The thing in the UK is that they are changing their interpretation of the GDPR to make it more, as they call it, business friendly, at the cost of the integrity of the individuals. And we don't really know how far the UK will take this, but the further away they step from the GDPR, the less likely it is that the European Commission would grant them another equivalency decision. So we could find ourselves in the same situation as with America, because with America, they don't have this decision. They have an agreement in place because they do not offer the same security. But we have this agreement that makes it possible anyway. So we could see a future in the UK where we need to have this agreement that the companies need to make certain security measures, but it will be more and more difficult to send data to the UK, which feels a bit odd because a few years ago they were members of the European Union. But the UK politics is moving away from these articles in the GDPR, so we will just have to wait and see on how far they will take it in their pursuit of being more business friendly.
Yes.
Let's see.
Great. We have some more questions as well. So about the consent function, will it be possible to get a consent button added to a specific document? For example, if we want to be able to see who consents to having their photo added to our website. Yes, this is possible to solve with Hailey. It doesn't look exactly as you described it with the consent button in the contract, but we can have it as a field or send something if we want to send a document for signature as well to have that kind of consent. There are a few ways we can go about it, but that actually, the one that you mentioned here, the consent for photos and social media and that stuff, is something that we use internally as Hailey as well. So when you start your employment here, you get to either fill in yes or no the consent to having your photo shared. So that's something we use it for as well.
Yeah, and just the importance there is that this field is not filled in the beginning, so you need to fill it yourself. You need to give consent. Consent cannot be expected.
Yes, that's a good point to add. And then we have still one more question. We don't use consent for anything but photos, so it's a very specific question. Oh, it's related to the other one, but a consent button would also be I have read this document button. Either way, is that function coming? Yes, so the photo consent, as we said, already exists, and we have a digital signature within Hailey that we use for consent management in reading documents and policies and so on. So we have a solution for that as well.
Yeah, so you could send out a policy that requires just a digital autograph that I have read this information and I have understood it. So I think that answers your question. Otherwise, just write to us again.
Yes. But that are all the questions that we've gotten in so far. So a huge thank you to everyone who has participated in this webinar this morning. The recording of this will be sent to all of your emails that you signed up with. So if you want to look back at all of the massive information loads that Jacob just told you about the legislation, you will all have the recording in your inboxes soon. And if there's anything more you would like to know about Hailey, you can do that through our website or just by clicking book a demo of Hailey on the bottom page here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.